Hi, in today's video I wanted to discuss things like power consumption, how you can save power with the NAS that you have already, or if you are thinking of getting a NAS, picking the right one so that it's not perhaps using too much power for your requirements. So the first thing I want to do before I go into the settings on the NAS is I'd like to put up some information on things that can affect the power consumption of the NAS that is not the QNAP itself. So here we've got the drive power consumption from two different manufacturers with both hard drives and SSDs. So here you can see with the WD Red and Red Plus, which is their sort of lower performance option out of their two options. They've got the Pro as well. It only uses 4.8 watts for the standard one, which spins at just over 5,000 RPM. And you've got the Red Pro that spins at just over 7,000 RPM, uses 7.2 watts. So if you don't need a performance drive, you can get the sort of lower cost drive, which also saves you power usage as well. Obviously, you can multiply these figures by the number of drives in your NAS. If you have our TVS H1288X, for example, it could take 8 of these drives. So when you take this power difference between the two drives and you multiply it by 8, it does start adding up to a significant amount, especially when you, say, do it over the lifespan of the NAS. It's going to be a lot of extra power. As you go down through the Seagate options, I've highlighted something here with the Seagate options between the 4 and 8 terabytes. So the same series of drive with very similar performance. The 4 terabyte only uses 9 watts, whereas the 8 terabyte uses an extra watt of power. So depending even within the same series, some of the drives can use more power than different drives. So really make sure that you look at the different drives you want to use. Same with the SSDs. So I've tried to pick here, these are just two SATA SSDs. I didn't go into the NVMe side of things. And I didn't put idle figures as well, simply because different manufacturers were putting things, instead of in watts, they were doing it in amps. So rather than do all the calculations, I've just left them off for now. But here we've got the read and write figures for the WD Red SA500 and the Seagate Iron Wolf 125, just to illustrate the difference between the 4 terabyte options there, between those as well. So I've also selected a series of QNAP NAS just to show you the different options within the QNAP NAS themselves. So I've started at the top with the TS233, one of the lower power consumption NAS that we've got, which is the one I'll do a little demo on today with you. So that one only uses just over 10 watts when fully operating, fully populated with drives, and less than half that when the hard drives have gone to sleep. As we start moving through the range and going up, you can see at the upper end of the spectrum here with the TVS H1288X, it's using just under 100 watts. Now that would be with all 8 3.5-inch drive bays filled, 4 2.5-inch drive bays filled, as well as 2 M.2 NVMe slots filled. So it's going to use a significant amount of power. So if you don't need that level of horsepower in a NAS, you can always go with something else. You know, we do smaller NAS, we do less powerful NAS that are going to use a lot less power. So for example, between the TVS H1288X and the TS473A, it's about a third of the power usage with the TS473A. We do 8-bay versions of that as well if you needed a larger one. Obviously we'll use a little bit more power, but not as much as the TVS H1288X. I've also done a small cross section here with just a couple of our rack mount units. So the TS435XEU, one of the lowest power consumption ones we have, that only uses just over 30 watts, fully populated. That's with 4 3.5-inch hard drives and 2 M.2 NVMe's, and it uses about nearly half that when the hard drives have gone to sleep. And the final one here is our quad-core Celeron unit that's got redundant, dual hot swap redundant power supplies. So it's still using less than a 60-watt light bulb when it's fully operating, with 8 hard drives in there, all working together. And when the hard drives have gone to sleep again, it uses about half the rated power. So I'd like to talk you through some of the settings there. So one of the ones I'll focus on first is the hard drive sleep that I was talking about. So if you go into the control panel on the QNAP, now this setting is on by default, but when you're in control panel, you'll see the hardware option at the top right. So when you go in there, there's a tick box. It's usually ticked by default, and this option will be set to 30 minutes. That's just under it. This is the disk standby mode. So this is saying that the hard drives will go to sleep after a period of 30 minutes of inactivity. Now, there are a few things that will stop that from ever working. For example, if you're running certain things on your NAS that run at intervals of less than 30 minutes, or you've got access constantly 24 hours throughout the day to your NAS, there's never a period where the NAS will be idle for 30 minutes, so it may never go to sleep in some instances. So some examples of software that you can run on your NAS that will prevent this from ever working would be things like surveillance software. So if you're running our QVR Pro or QVR Elite software, if it's recording cameras 24/7, the hard drives are never going to be idle to go to sleep. Same with something like a Plex media server, DLNA media server, so you can set those to scan for new media, things like that. So when they're doing their scans, obviously it's going to do disk activity, so it's going to prevent it from allowing the disks to go to sleep. So just be mindful that this may not always work. It does depend on how you configure your NAS. This NAS is set up straight out the box, and while I've had it sat on my desk here, I've heard them spin down and spin up a couple of times as I've been, taking a break for lunch and then coming back and clicking something again. Then they start spinning up, but you can audibly hear them spinning down and spinning up usually if you're within earshot of your NAS. So this is one option that you can use. We do also have a smart fan, so this is just really make sure your NAS is in a well ventilated location. The normal mode should be all anybody needs. We do have an option that uses a little less power. On a small unit like this TS233 with a single fan, it's really not going to make any difference to power consumption. But larger units with multiple fans, you could save a couple of watts potentially by spinning the fans a bit slower. So you can set it down to quiet mode. Just make sure that the NAS doesn't get too hot. It's going to start popping up alerts at you if anything in there does get too hot, so you can ramp it back up again. But normal mode will work for most. If the NAS gets hot, it spins them faster. If it's cool enough, it spins them slower. But as I say, you can take over a bit of control, or absolutely just set the fan speed manually if you wish as well. So that's the disk standby mode or disk sleep function that a lot of drive makers will talk about when the drives go idle. So that's how you would enable that feature. Now the next setting down in the control panel here under hardware is power. So in power, the first thing we're going to see here is the EUP mode configuration. So this is EUP stands for Energy Using Products. It's a directive by the European Union designed to improve energy efficiency. So by default, most QNAPs will have this set to disable. Now this is effectively going to mean that your QNAP, if it's plugged into power, will use just over 1 watt of power. This is enabling a few functions to work, which are the 3 functions that we've got listed here. Things like wake on LAN, power recovery, so that's what happens if the power fails and then comes back. What does your NAS do? As well as power schedule. If you have this set to enable, so you've enabled the EUP mode configuration, it will in effect stop these 3 settings from working. So any settings that you've got in there will just not work if this is set to the enabled option. So whilst this is going to use some power, I generally recommend having this on disable and using a combination of the other features to actually save more power. So one of the options here is power schedule. So if there are certain times in a day when you will never use your NAS, for the most part, you can enable the schedule. So with this setup here, I could say have my NAS to do the action of shutdown every day. Let's say at 10 o'clock at night. I won't be using my NAS after 10 o'clock at night, so I can set that up there. I can then also add a complementary rule here, such as turn on the server every day at 7 AM. So I know I'm going to need my NAS up and running again, so while I'm sleeping, my NAS is going to be powered down, turned off, and really just using that 1 watt of power that the EUP mode configuration is enabling it. But this is going to allow my NAS to effectively not use power with this setup for 9 hours. So it's going to use just that 1 watt of power for the 9 hours rather than potentially the 10 watts it might use when being turned on. So the power schedule is a really great option to use if you can get around using it, if you know that there are certain times in a day where you will not need the NAS to be powered on. unbroken rules, if you like. If you decide that 11 p.m. after your NAS has already turned off, that you actually do still need to use it, you do want to do something on the NAS, you can just walk up to the NAS, push the power button. It will turn on. It will take a couple of minutes to boot up, but once the NAS is powered on, you can use it, and this power schedule will still work. It'll just ignore the wake up at 7 a.m. Option that you've got here, and it'll just turn off at the next off time, because it would already be on at 7 a.m. if you left it on. You can of course turn it on at say 11 p.m. and then manually shut it down here at midnight. Then the turn on server at 7 a.m. would still take effect. Now if you're not near your NAS but you are in the same network, so for me, I have a lot of my NAS are in the rack cabinet in the garage. So if I ever need to turn on a NAS that's out there, sure, I could walk out to the garage and go do that. Or what I can do is I can use a Wake on LAN feature that we have. So Wake on LAN is over here. It's enabled by default. It doesn't generally work on all Ethernet ports on some QNAPs. So if it's a SFP plus port, it generally won't work. If it's a port added in with a PCI Express card, it also will not work. It has to be usually one of the onboard ports. So on this TS233, it's only got a single Ethernet port. It's on board. It does support Wake on LAN. So for this one, I can turn it on. To turn on a QNAP using Wake on LAN, you can use any Wake on LAN client out there that you want, or just use the QFinder Pro software that we supply for free. So any NAS that's ever been discovered in the software can be woken up. So there's a button at the top right here with the little sort of power plug symbol on it. If you click that, it's going to show every QNAP that it's ever found, not just the ones that it's currently seeing in the list that are turned on, but you can go through this list here and you can turn on any NAS. So here, if I wanted to turn on the TVS-H1288X that I do a lot of these videos on, I can just highlight it there and I can click Wake Up, and it's going to send a Wake on LAN packet across my network to turn that on. Now in the case of this one, I've got mine connected with one of the 2.5 gig onboard LAN ports, so that would work. If I'd connected it with the 10 gig port that comes with the TVS-H1288X, I would not be able to wake it up using that port because it's a PCI Express card based port. So if it's one of the onboard ones, you're able to wake it up from here. So that's the remote wake up feature. So it only works in the same LAN. There are a few notes here. So it's only going to work if it's a PC in the same LAN. It's Wake on LAN, not Wake on WAN. You can't wake it up from across the internet with this software. Some routers may have a Wake on LAN feature in them, so if you can remotely access your router that's in your network where your QNAP is, you can tell your router to send the Wake on LAN packet sometimes, so that's sometimes an option that you can use to turn it on. It's exactly the same thing as walking up to the QNAP and pushing the power button. It just turns it on. And just while we're here, I'll cover off power recovery. So this is just two options. So imagine that the power failed and your QNAP was on. When the power comes back, this is going to restore the previous NAS power state. So if it was on before the power failed, it's going to turn it back on. So for me personally, I generally say keep the NAS turned off. Just as a rule, when power goes off and then comes back, quite a lot, it doesn't always just come back and stay on. It might go off on a couple of times. In my area anyway, so for me I generally set it to keep the NAS turned off. I'll turn it back on when I'm sure the power's been back on long enough to be considered stable. But that's just the other options that you've got. So if anybody has any questions on any of these settings, please do let me know. I find the power schedule feature probably the most useful at saving power. So I do have a backup NAS. I only let it turn on for about an hour a day. A half hour before my backup job runs from my main NAS, and then it turns off again about half an hour after the backup job runs. I've checked the backup job. My backup job generally finishes in less than 10 minutes, so that's usually plenty of time, and I give it a half an hour to do the full wake up. So yeah, that's the different power options. Hopefully that helps someone out there to use a little bit less power with your NAS. But again, one of the most important things is just make sure you size the NAS correctly. Don't get one that's necessarily too powerful with really fast drives if all you're using it for is a backup target once a day. You could potentially go with something that uses a lot less power with slower drives, and it's going to perform the exact same function but use a massive amount less power throughout the years. Okay, again, if anybody has any questions, please do get in touch with us in the comments section down below, and we'll do our best to get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks a lot. Bye.